The World Inside by Robert Silverberg, published in 1971. Now, I did say that I wasn't going to read any more Robert Silverberg books this year because I've read 4 or 5 already, and there are a number of different authors that I really wanted to get to. But then Robin from the channel Bookspin reached out and asked if I wanted to read this one together and then discuss it on his channel. So I've done that, and I encourage you to go and watch that video because I'm not going to do a full review in this video, but I will give you a brief overview of the book and my high-level thoughts on it. This is set in a world where the Earth has become incredibly overpopulated, and the solution to that has been to migrate most of the human population into these enormous high-rise structures called urban monads, or urbmons for short, which house tens of millions of people on hundreds and hundreds of different floors. And there are a number of these urbmons around the planet, with the human population on Earth reaching around 70 billion. To support these urbmon structures and the humans that live there, the rest of the Earth's surface has mostly been converted into farmland, where these rural communities live and work to provide food to the urbmons. Because everyone in these structures are living so close together, the population density is so high, this is a post-privacy civilization, which means that there's no real concept of ownership, and actually a strange tradition has become established, which is referred to as night walking, where mostly men, but sometimes women, at night will prowl the halls of these urbmons and go into different apartments to sleep with other people, which everyone has to pretty much accept. If somebody makes a sexual advance to you or your partner, you pretty much can't refuse it in this society, and everyone is open and welcome to these kind of encounters. Generally, the higher the floor in the urbmon, the higher the class and the higher the wealth and status of the people that live there, which is a similar idea to J.G. Ballard's High Rise. And if you reject the norms of the society here, you are referred to as going flippo. And if you're recognised to be a flippo, you are thrown down the chute, which is this enormous shaft that runs the entire length of the building, all the way down into these sprawling incinerators, which actually go on to power the building. So really this is an exploration and comparison between this liberal, polyamorous society versus the sort of conservative, monogamous society that most of the world chooses to adopt today. And the structure of this novel is interesting because it doesn't necessarily have an overarching plot, and is more sort of vignettes that you get through different character perspectives who are located in different levels of the building. And many of them are having challenges adapting to this society and potentially going flippo themselves. So you do get this story that is kind of fragmented and broken up, with links between certain characters and overlaps in terms of some of those vignettes that I mentioned. And there are a few amazing sections of this book. There's one where you follow this kind of orchestral musician who is conducting this show for the inhabitants of his floor, and they play these strange instruments which seem to conduct these holographic projections of planets and constellations which swirl around in this amphitheatre, generating incredible resonance and soundscapes that's described in a very vivid way. There's another sequence I really liked, which is this historian documenting society in the 20th century and comparing it to civilization within the urbmons. And he is going through this conversation in his mind between himself and an imagined advocate for 20th century living, which is really where you get some of that core debate between the more conservative attitudes versus the more liberal lifestyles employed within these buildings. There was another section where One of the characters takes this drug called multiplexer, which essentially allows you to tap into the consciousness of all of the inhabitants of the Erbmon that you're in, and have this psychedelic, hallucinatory experience where you're feeling everything happening in the building all at once, able to jump into other people's minds, and almost become one with the structure. And that's something that Robert Silverberg does write a lot about, is these mind-altering substances. It crops up time and time again in his work. And something else that crops up time and time again in his work are these sexual elements. And this is by far the most explicit book that I've read from Silverberg, who does have a history of writing erotic fiction, and he weaves that into his science fiction tales. But here, it would almost be difficult to flip to a page and not find some sort of sexual encounter or content or reference. And I think your enjoyment of this book is going to depend on your tolerance for this sort of stuff. Generally, I didn't really mind it. It is taking you outside of your comfort zone and plunging you into a society which is completely different from our own for the most part. But it does get quite excessive, it does get quite repetitive, and at times does feel like filler content in the middle of those more amazing sections that I mentioned earlier on. There's tons of other stuff in here, like moral engineers that will conduct social engineering on people that are at risk of going flippo. There are hormonal drugs that people take to influence the attitudes of people around them. But I'm not going to get into any more of that here, and once again I encourage you to go and check out my discussion with Robin. So overall, I did enjoy this. It's not my favourite Silverberg by a long shot, but something that I really like about his books is that even when I don't love them, they always leave me with something to chew on and think about long after I put the book down. Will I stick to what I said about not reading any more Silverberg this year? Probably not. I just enjoy his work so much that I'll probably come back to him if I read a couple of things that I didn't enjoy so much, because I can rely on him to do something interesting. Oh, my brothers. That is going to make what's already a difficult review even more difficult, because the next book that I read is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. I've got this Penguin Modern Classics edition here. Published originally in 1961. This is a strange dystopian book that was adapted into a very notorious film by Stanley Kubrick. And actually, I'd put off reading this book for a while because that film ranks pretty low down in Stanley Kubrick's filmography for me personally. But then, as you may or may not know, I am reading through science fiction, the 100 best novels by David Pringle, and A Clockwork Orange appears in that list, so I was intrigued and decided to finally pick it up. And this is the story of a teenage boy living in a near future England which is overcome by gang violence and social disorder. He is part of a gang himself. They hang out at these milk bars, hence the milk chugging that I've just done, where they drink what they call Moloko Plus or Milk Plus, which is this milk drink laced with a hallucinogenic drug. They wear strange flamboyant outfits and commit random brutal acts of violence and vandalism. They speak in this incredibly strange way where they will swap out normal words and terms with this incredibly distinct slang which incorporates elements of Cockney rhyming slang and the Russian language in a way that really early on makes this book almost incomprehensible. You're reading the passages in the first couple of pages and you've got absolutely no idea what these people are talking about or what they're referring to. But what's incredibly interesting about this book is that very, very quickly, because of the context alone, you start figuring out what these words and terms mean. Even though Burgess doesn't directly tell you, for the most part, what these characters are talking about. And by the end, you're able to almost seamlessly decipher this dialogue, which made for an incredibly satisfying reading experience. And that's on top of all of this exploration of civil unrest and social engineering that the book is doing. These acts of ultra-violence are incredibly disturbing to read at times. But then once again, there are passages where I found myself laughing out loud at this bizarre dialogue, this strange world, and these over-the-top characters. So you get this experience that is simultaneously unsettling and funny, while also being initially challenging and eventually satisfying. And I think any book that can make me feel that mix of emotions must be pretty great. Saying that though, I don't think that this book will be for everyone just because of some of those elements that I already mentioned. There's the potential that some people will find this incredibly annoying. Sometimes I do find these made-up terminologies in science fiction novels to be quite frustrating myself. I read Stand on Zanzibar earlier this year, and that does a similar thing, which I didn't get on with particularly well. But this linguistic exercise that Burgess is carrying out is done in an incredibly clever way, in my opinion. So there you go, another book ticked off of this list, and 2 books set in strange dystopian worlds. Thank you very much for watching, liking and subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one.